The year is 2025. The world has entered a new era of upheaval. Former superpowers still cling to their dream of controlling the global order, while smaller nations begin to rise, not through weapons, but through willpower and courage. On the chessboard of international politics, one seemingly small country has made the world stop and look. Burkina Faso, a land scorched by the African sun, shaped by a history of sweat, struggle, and sacrifice. And from this land emerged a man, young, resolute, and unafraid, Ibrahim Traoré. While many nations still bowed to tempting offers from global powers, Burkina Faso, under Traoré's leadership, chose the harder road, the path of independence, self-reliance, and uncompromising dignity. The West couldn't comprehend it. A country without major industry, without a formidable military, dared to challenge the invisible hands pulling the strings of world affairs, dared to say no to international financial institutions, to NATO, even to the United States. But they had forgotten one thing, something stronger than money or missiles: national pride, an unyielding spirit, and the belief in a future written by one's own hands. Burkina Faso was not alone. Its story began to resonate across the world. From the slums of Rio to narrow streets in Hanoi to the hearts of young black men in Chicago. In Traoré's eyes, they saw something familiar, the burning desire to reclaim their destiny. And in that very moment, when the world held its breath, an offer arrived from Washington, one gilded with promise, with sweet words and brighter prospects. But behind it lay the shadow of control, of that so-called world order long used to bind weaker nations. The world waited. Would this young leader from Burkina Faso retreat, or would he once again leave the world speechless? The answer would become one of the boldest acts of courage in modern history. What happens when a young leader, barely in his 30s, dares to say no to the greatest superpower on earth? The world didn't hear his answer right away. It wasn't a public spectacle. No fiery speeches, no fists raised in defiance, just a simple shake of the head behind closed doors. And the most powerful man in the world left Ouagadougou with a forced smile and clenched jaw. But the silence didn't last long. Within days, whispers began to spread. Traoré rejected the deal. Burkina Faso turned its back on the West. They must be insane, because what the United States had offered wasn't just money. It was control, dressed up as partnership, a multi-billion-dollar aid package tied to exclusive mining rights. Infrastructure investments, yes, but also the presence of private military contractors. A media expansion program to promote democracy, but managed by foreign hands. And behind it all, the quiet expectation that Burkina Faso would fall back into the old pattern. Obedient, dependent, predictable. Traoré saw through it. He didn't react emotionally. He didn't rant. He didn't hide. Instead, he called in his closest advisors, military minds, economic thinkers, and regional strategists. He laid the deal bare on the table and asked one question: what is the price of our dignity? There were no easy answers. Burkina Faso was still fragile. The economy strained, internal factions stirred, external threats loomed, terrorist groups, foreign interference, international sanctions. Everyone knew that saying no might mean facing all of them at once. But that's where courage begins, not in certainty, but in conviction. Traoré's government didn't crumble, it hardened. Ministries began reviewing foreign contracts. Radio silence from embassies was met with calm resolve. The streets of Ouagadougou were tense but not fearful. In quiet corners of cafes and public markets, people debated not if their president was right, but whether he could survive what would come next. And then, just as the pressure seemed to peak, Traoré stepped forward, not with rage but with clarity. He addressed the nation, not through grandiose spectacle, but through sincerity. We were not elected to serve foreign interests. We were not put here to sell what belongs to our children. We are not afraid to walk alone, if that is what freedom demands. The world watched. Some laughed, some applauded, but all took notice. In a continent where many had grown used to compromise, Traoré chose confrontation, with courage, with intellect, with the weight of a people behind him. And so the silence was broken, not with war drums, but with a promise. Burkina Faso would not be bought. The day President Traoré stood firm before the world and refused the offer, Burkina Faso erupted, not in fear but in fire, not of chaos but of courage. The retaliation was swift. Sanctions rained down. Western media labeled him a rogue, a dictator, a destabilizing force. Banks froze foreign aid. Supply chains halted. French troops accelerated their withdrawal, leaving behind a void that many assumed would turn into disaster. But the West miscalculated one thing: the strength of a people who have already survived hell. For decades, they endured exploitation, betrayal, and poverty handed down by colonial policies disguised as cooperation. When you've been to the bottom, fear loses its grip. Markets emptied, gas prices soared, hospitals faced shortages, but no one bowed, no one begged. In the heart of Ouagadougou, a grandmother named Awa tightened her headscarf and told a reporter, "Let them take their aid. We've lived on less. We'll live with honor." Farmers returned to their fields even under threat. Teachers taught history not from books, but from the streets, pointing at murals of Traoré and Thomas Sankara painted on the walls. Symbols of a new era rising. In the countryside, communities pooled their resources. Food was shared. Elders spoke to the youth about how true freedom comes with a price, and they were ready to pay. But something even more powerful happened. Africa listened. From Mali to Niger, from Guinea to Chad, people began to chant his name. Traoré, they whispered, is not just a man, he is a message. African youth, disillusioned by decades of foreign promises and empty handshakes, suddenly saw a leader who didn't flinch. Protests erupted, but this time in solidarity, not against their governments, but against the puppeteers behind them. In Senegal, a student named Issa posted a video that went viral. Tears in his eyes, he said, "They told us we were weak. They told us we needed help. But look at Burkina Faso. They stood alone, and they are still standing. We must too." Even in Europe, the diaspora awakened. In Paris, London, Berlin, African migrants organized marches, waving not just the flags of their birth countries, but banners saying, "United Africa begins now." Burkina Faso was under pressure, yes, but never before had the people stood taller. And in the center of it all, Traoré did not hide. He walked the streets without a bulletproof vest. He met with farmers, soldiers, mothers. He listened, he led, he told them, they have the money, we have the spirit, they have the media, we have the truth. And the people believed. Because sometimes leadership isn't about speeches or strategies. It's about courage in the face of collapse. It's about standing when the world expects you to fall. It's about being the storm, not just weathering it. In those darkest weeks, when every foreign expert predicted the crumble of Traoré's government, something unexpected bloomed. Unity, not imposed, not bought, but born from struggle, forged in resistance, inspired by pride. This was no longer about one man refusing one deal. It was about a continent, long silenced, whispering its first word, no. And behind that word stood millions. After Traoré's powerful and resolute rejection of the deal, a new wave began to spread across African nations. Like a fire igniting in the darkness of night, his actions were not merely a solitary resistance, but the spark of a larger, historic movement. This was not just a rejection of a single deal. It was a declaration of war against a world that had long dictated the fate of African nations. Rebuilding an independent continent. In the months following this groundbreaking rejection, African nations no longer waited for aid from Western powers. Instead, they began forging new relationships based on equality and partnership. The countries, long accustomed to poverty and dependence on international assistance, now started to craft their own plans for rebuilding and self-reliance. Burkina Faso, under Traoré's leadership, became the trailblazer for this new wave. They launched a self-sustaining agricultural campaign, sought new markets outside the Western-dominated system, and began the painstaking process of rebuilding their war-torn infrastructure. From small-scale projects, the nation began to thrive and became a beacon of hope and inspiration for other countries across the region. A new African Union. Africa began to form powerful new alliances with countries that shared similar aspirations. Relations with non-Western powers such as Russia and China began to tighten. These nations engaged in close dialogues, forming not just economic partnerships, but military alliances designed to protect shared interests and build a future free from Western domination. The new African Union wasn't just an economic bloc. It represented a long-term vision of self-determination, with African countries standing on their own 2 feet, no longer beholden to the whims of foreign powers. International forums began to discuss the possibility of creating alternative financial systems, ones that didn't rely on international banks controlled by Western countries. Western response. At first, the West responded with skepticism. They watched with suspicion, unsure of how the situation would unfold. But as the movement grew stronger and African nations began to prove their resilience and self-sufficiency, the West started to realize that things were changing. This was no longer just a rejection of one deal, it was a statement that Africa was no longer willing to be controlled. Initially, the Western powers hoped this would be a temporary phase, but as time passed, they could no longer ignore the growing momentum in Africa. The continent had shown that it could rise from its past challenges and stand strong. The message was clear. Africa was ready to define its own future. The West, once the dominant force in global relations, could no longer hold the reins of power when it came to Africa. The African nations had made it clear that their future would no longer be shaped by foreign influence. The rise of national pride and identity. This event ignited a renewed sense of national pride and identity across the African continent. No longer seen as victims, African people began to believe in their own power, in their own right to control their destiny. The rejection became a symbol of defiance against all odds and an emblem of hope for the future. Across the continent, leaders and citizens alike rallied behind Traoré and the vision he had set forth. His name became synonymous with courage, integrity, and the spirit of independence. From bustling cities to rural villages, his words echoed, inspiring ordinary people to take action in their own lives. The sense of unity and solidarity grew stronger as people from different nations began to see that their fates were now intertwined. The continent had begun to realize that it was not just about one nation, but about the whole of Africa, united, strong, and free. They were no longer pawns in a geopolitical game. Africa had awakened, and its people were now the true architects of their future. The West's dilemma. As Africa embraced its newfound independence, the West was left in a dilemma. How could they continue to dominate a continent that had found its voice? Initially, they attempted to isolate the rising powers of Africa, but their efforts were in vain. Trade routes shifted, alliances deepened, and African nations began to lead the charge in international diplomacy. The West could no longer dictate the terms of engagement. Their old tactics, which had once kept African nations under control, no longer held. The West could no longer dictate the terms of engagement. Their old tactics, which had once kept African nations under control, no longer held sway. This wasn't just a shift in power, it was a seismic change in the world order. Conclusion. From the strong defiance of Traoré to the historic rejection of foreign control, Africa embarked on a path to revival and independence. The continent, once held captive by colonial legacies and external manipulation, had found its strength. This was not just the beginning of a new chapter for Burkina Faso. It was the birth of a new Africa, an Africa that would no longer be defined by others, but by itself. In this moment, Africa had proven its ability to rise above, to reject the status quo, and to chart its own course. This was the Africa of tomorrow, bold, united, and free. This expanded version provides a more powerful climax, showing how the rejection of foreign influence sets off a chain reaction across the continent, leading to newfound unity, self-determination, and national pride. As the world watched, the reverberations of Captain Ibrahim Traoré's decision spread far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. His refusal to submit to foreign pressure, to allow his country's resources to be controlled by powers who had long sought to exploit them, became a beacon of hope and inspiration. In those tense moments, when he stood resolute in the face of overwhelming odds, Traoré showed not just his country, but the entire world what true leadership meant. Burkina Faso, a nation often overlooked on the global stage, had now captured the attention of millions. The weight of Traor's decision was immense, but he carried it with grace. He stood firm, knowing that what he was doing wasn't just for the people of Burkina Faso. It was for Africa, for the future of nations everywhere that had long been denied the right to determine their own destiny. In the months that followed, the world watched as Burkina Faso slowly but surely charted its own path. The support that Traoré received from his people was overwhelming. The youth, who had once felt powerless, now saw in their leader a figure of immense courage. The streets of Ouagadougou, the heart of the nation, were filled with voices calling for unity, pride, and a new vision for their future. Traor's leadership had sparked a flame that would not easily be extinguished. However, as with every monumental decision, there were challenges ahead. The road to sovereignty was never going to be easy, and Traoré knew that his nation's struggle was far from over. But what he had achieved was something invaluable: the realization that they were not powerless, that they could stand tall and demand respect on their own terms. Even as critics from the West questioned his approach, Traor's resolve remained unshaken. He understood the complexities of geopolitics and the challenges that lay ahead. Yet he remained steadfast in his belief that true progress could only come when nations took control of their resources, their future, and their destiny. He had chosen the hard path, the path of sovereignty, of standing tall, even when it meant defying a superpower. Burkina Faso's decision became a symbol, a declaration that small nations, often dismissed by the powerful, could rise and assert their rightful place in the world. It wasn't about wealth or power. It was about dignity. It was about pride. And it was about ensuring that future generations would not be bound by the mistakes of the past. For the people of Burkina Faso, Traoré had given them more than just a president. He had given them hope. Hope that they could stand up to the forces that had long controlled their land. Hope that they could take their rightful place in the world. And perhaps most importantly, hope that they could shape their own future. As Traoré stood before his people in the days that followed, his message was clear. We are not afraid. We are proud of who we are and the path we are taking. This is just the beginning of a new chapter in our history. This wasn't just a victory for Burkina Faso. It was a victory for every nation that had ever been silenced, every people who had been oppressed. Traoré had shown that true power lies not in the hands of those who seek to exploit, but in the courage of those who dare to say no. In the coming years, the story of Captain Ibrahim Traoré would be told in the streets of Ouagadougou, in classrooms across Africa, and in the hearts of people who believe that even the smallest voice can make a difference. Burkina Faso had dared to dream of sovereignty, and with that, they had shown the world what true courage, pride, and determination really look like. This conclusion brings everything full circle, celebrating the courage and pride of Captain Ibrahim Traoré and his people while leaving a lasting message of hope and sovereignty. I hope this meets your expectations. Let me know if you'd like any changes.